Let's begin with something most people get completely wrong about avoidance. They assume the avoidant didn't care. They assume the avoidant felt nothing. They assume the coldness meant emptiness. But that interpretation is comforting, and it's inaccurate. Avoidants do not lack feelings, they suppress them. There's a profound psychological difference between not having emotion and not allowing yourself to experience it. Avoidant attachment is not emotional deficiency, it's emotional self-protection. Somewhere early in life, vulnerability became unsafe. Needs became inconvenient. Emotional expression became associated with rejection, criticism, or engulfment. So the nervous system adapted. It learned that the safest way to survive intimacy was to minimize it. When they were with you, they felt closeness, they felt connection, they felt the pull. And that's precisely the problem, because closeness activates their nervous system. It doesn't calm it. The more real it becomes, the more their internal alarm system activates. Not because you're wrong, not because the relationship is unhealthy, but because intimacy threatens the identity they've built around self-sufficiency. And when that alarm goes off, suppression begins. Suppression is sophisticated. It's not dramatic. It's subtle. It sounds like, I just need space. It looks like pulling back when things deepen. It manifests as intellectualizing feelings instead of expressing them. They convince themselves they're just being logical, independent, rational. But what's really happening is emotional compression. Now here's where shame quietly enters the picture. When they withdraw, when they go cold, when they fail to meet you emotionally, on some level, they know. They are not unaware. They are disconnected. And disconnection is not ignorance. Inside, there is a flicker of awareness. I should handle this better. I shouldn't shut down. They didn't deserve that. But instead of leaning into that discomfort and processing it, they push it further down. Because to fully feel guilt would require fully feeling vulnerability, and vulnerability is the very thing their system has been trained to avoid. So what do? They detach from the feeling itself. It's psychological compartmentalization. They put the relationship in a mental box. They reduce the intensity of the experience. They tell themselves it wasn't that deep. They focus on flaws. They magnify incompatibilities, not because those things are entirely false, but because those thoughts reduce emotional exposure. Understand this, suppression is exhausting. You might see someone who appears calm, unaffected, already moved on. But emotional suppression doesn't erase emotion, it stores it. The body keeps the score. The mind keeps the memory. The unresolved feeling lingers in quiet moments, late at night, in stillness, in comparison to future partners who don't feel the same. And this is why the avoidant can appear indifferent while internally carrying unprocessed emotion. They are not heartless. They are defended. There's a philosophical layer to this as well. To feel deeply requires courage. It requires the willingness to confront your own imperfection, to admit I hurt someone. Avoidants often pride themselves on competence, independence, rationality. To admit emotional failure threatens that identity. So instead of confronting the truth, they distance from it. They don't lack feelings. They lack the tolerance for emotional exposure. And that distinction matters, especially for you, because when someone suppresses emotion, it can look like you meant nothing, but often it means you meant too much. The connection activated something they were not prepared to handle. Now, this does not excuse the behavior, it explains it. And understanding the psychology is not about justifying the hurt. It's about freeing yourself from misinterpretation. They felt it, they just couldn't stay with it. And here's the truth you need to hold on to. When someone suppresses emotion instead of processing it, they don't escape the feeling, they postpone it. Now, once you understand that they suppress emotion rather than lack it, you can begin to see what's actually sitting underneath that suppression. And what sits underneath it is not arrogance. It's not cruelty. It's not indifference. It's shame. Shame is one of the most misunderstood emotional forces in human psychology. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Guilt can motivate repair. Shame motivates hiding, and avoidant attachment is built on hiding. Somewhere early in life, vulnerability became associated with inadequacy. Maybe their needs were dismissed. Maybe emotional expression was criticized. Maybe independence was praised and dependency was subtly shamed. The child learns a powerful equation. If I need too much, I am weak. If I feel too much, I am defective. So they construct an identity around not needing, not feeling, not depending. Now fast forward to your relationship. You show up open. You express emotion. You want closeness. And for a while, it feels good to them. But as intimacy deepens, something uncomfortable begins to surface. Not because you're demanding, not because you're wrong, but because real intimacy exposes the parts of them they work hardest to hide, the parts that feel inadequate, the parts that fear they won't measure up emotionally, the parts that worry they'll fail you. And here's where it becomes brutal. When they withdraw, when they shut down, when they treat you in ways that feel cold or dismissive, there is often an internal awareness that it's not their highest self. But instead of confronting that gap between who they want to be and how they are behaving, shame steps in, and shame doesn't say apologize. Shame says get out, because staying would require admitting imperfection. It would require saying, I handled that poorly. It would require tolerating the vulnerability of being seen in a flawed moment. And for someone wired to equate vulnerability with exposure, that feels unbearable. So they distance from you, not just physically, but psychologically. They create space so they don't have to sit in the discomfort of self-reflection. They may even become defensive if confronted, not because your feelings are invalid, but because your feedback threatens the fragile structure of self-protection they've built. Understand this clearly. Shame is deeply self-focused. It's not about you, it's about their internal narrative. When they hurt you, it clashes with the identity they try to maintain: competent, independent, emotionally controlled. That clash creates cognitive dissonance, and instead of resolving it through growth, many avoidants resolve it through escape. It's easier to leave than to feel exposed. It's easier to label the relationship too intense than to admit, I struggle with emotional depth. It's easier to say, you're too sensitive, than to confront, I feel inadequate when I can't meet emotional needs. And the tragedy is this: shame thrives in silence. The less it's acknowledged, the stronger it becomes. So the avoidant doesn't just avoid you, they avoid themselves. This is why their behavior can feel so confusing. One moment they seem connected, the next detached. The shift isn't random. It's triggered by the activation of shame, the fear that they are being seen too clearly. And when someone cannot tolerate being seen, they will sabotage closeness to restore emotional safety. Now, here's the key insight for you. Their inability to face shame does not mean you were unworthy of love. In many cases, it means you brought them face to face with parts of themselves they've been running from for years. You didn't trigger their weakness, you exposed their unhealed wound. And until someone is willing to confront shame with self-awareness and courage, they will continue choosing distance over growth. Because shame unexamined does not create transformation, it creates avoidance. And when a person would rather escape than evolve, they don't lose you because you weren't enough. They lose you because facing themselves felt like too much. And once shame is activated, the mind does something very strategic. It protects the ego. Because if they were to fully admit, I mishandled someone who loved me, that realization would demand responsibility. It would demand growth. It would demand humility. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional control and independence, that level of accountability feels destabilizing. So instead of confronting the truth, they reconstruct it. This is where the narrative begins to shift. You'll hear things like, it wasn't that serious, or we just weren't compatible, or you needed more than I could give. On the surface, these statements sound reasonable, mature even. But look deeper. Often they're not conclusions reached through deep reflection. They're psychological shields. The human mind is extraordinarily skilled at rewriting memory to reduce discomfort. It's called cognitive dissonance reduction. When behavior and self-image don't align, the mind adjusts the story to restore internal balance. If they see themselves as a decent, rational person, and yet they withdrew, avoided, or treated you in a way that caused harm, something has to give. And instead of adjusting the behavior in hindsight, they adjust the interpretation. They minimize the depth of the connection. They exaggerate your flaws. They focus on moments of tension instead of moments of intimacy. They tell themselves the relationship was flawed from the beginning. Not necessarily because that's the objective truth, but because that version of the story hurts less. If they can convince themselves it wasn't that meaningful, then losing it doesn't require grief. If they can convince themselves you were too emotional, then they don't have to examine their emotional unavailability. If they can convince themselves it simply ran its course, they don't have to confront the possibility that they ran from it. Understand, this is rarely conscious manipulation. It's subconscious, self-preservation. The ego's primary function is protection. And when shame threatens identity, the ego builds a narrative fortress. But here's the psychological cost. When you rewrite reality to protect your ego, you also block growth. Because growth requires accurate reflection. It requires the ability to say, I see where I contributed to the breakdown. Without that level of ownership, patterns repeat. And this is why avoidants often move into the next relationship carrying the same unresolved dynamics. The story has been edited, but the wound remains. Now, from your perspective, this rewriting can feel deeply invalidating. You may think, how can they act like it didn't matter? Or how can they reduce what we had to something so small? That reduction can feel like erasure. But remember, minimizing the relationship is often their way of minimizing the shame attached to it. The deeper the connection, the more threatening the loss. The more genuine your love, the more confronting their withdrawal becomes. So they scale it down. They intellectualize it. They package it neatly. Because neat stories don't demand emotional excavation. And here's the philosophical truth beneath all of this. The story we tell ourselves determines the person we become. If someone continually edits their narrative to avoid accountability, they remain trapped inside the same psychological loop. They don't evolve. They justify. This doesn't mean every relationship failure is one-sided. It doesn't mean there weren't genuine incompatibilities, but when the rewriting serves primarily to preserve ego rather than uncover truth, it's avoidance disguised as clarity. And eventually, reality catches up. Because you can distort memory, but you cannot fully silence the subconscious. The quiet moments return. The comparisons emerge. The awareness flickers back. The truth doesn't disappear. It waits. And here's what you must understand. When someone has to rewrite the story to live with themselves, it says more about their internal conflict than it ever did about your worth. Because people who are at peace with their behavior don't need to revise history to survive it. And after the story has been rewritten, after the ego has been protected, what you often see next is what looks like indifference. They seem fine, maybe even better than fine. They're posting, they're social. They might move into something new quickly. There's a calmness to them that can feel almost offensive when you're still processing the emotional aftermath. And this is where many people misinterpret what's happening. Indifference is not always the absence of feeling. Very often it is the presence of defense. Avoidants are highly skilled at emotional deactivation. When something becomes too intense, too vulnerable, too exposing, their nervous system shifts into self-protection mode. They suppress attachment signals. They downregulate emotional engagement. It's not conscious cruelty, it's conditioning. Think about it neurologically. When closeness activates discomfort, the brain searches for relief. Relief can come through distraction, rationalization, or replacement. A new connection provides novelty. Novelty provides dopamine. Dopamine reduces emotional pain temporarily. Work, goals, independence, even hyperproductivity can serve the same function. They create movement so the person doesn't have to sit still with unresolved emotion. So from the outside, it looks like they've moved on effortlessly. But anesthesia is not healing. When a surgeon uses anesthesia, the body doesn't stop being injured. It simply stops feeling the pain in the moment. Emotional numbing works the same way. The pain is not processed, it is postponed. And here's the critical distinction. Secure individuals process loss through reflection and integration. Avoidant individuals often process loss through suppression and substitution. That quick rebound, it may not be depth, it may be distraction. That calm detachment, it may not be peace, it may be emotional shutdown. That silence, it may not be closure, it may be avoidance of the mirror. Because to sit with what happened would require them to revisit the shame, the guilt, the awareness that they withdrew instead of leaned in. And if someone has not built the emotional tolerance to face discomfort, they will choose numbness over growth every time. Now let's be clear. Not every avoidant is consciously running. Some truly believe they are fine. That's the complexity of defense mechanisms. They can be so automatic that the person doesn't recognize them as defenses, but the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Unprocessed emotion doesn't vanish. It resurfaces in subtle ways. Irritability, restlessness, dissatisfaction in future relationships. Patterns repeat because the root was never addressed. Fifth is is why you may see them cycle through connections that lack the depth you once shared. Depth requires vulnerability. Vulnerability triggers discomfort. So they unconsciously choose situations that feel safer, less intimate, less demanding, less exposing. And again, from your side, this can sting. It can make you question your significance. If I mattered, how can they seem so unaffected? But significance is not measured by visible grief. Sometimes the people who feel the most are the ones who show the least, because showing it would threaten the identity they've built around emotional control. Here's the philosophical reality. Indifference can be a mask for unresolved attachment. The louder the display of independence, the more it may be compensating for something internally unsettled. Now, this does not mean they are secretly falling apart. It means emotional suppression creates delayed consequences. What is avoided today must be confronted tomorrow in one form or another. And the most important part for you to understand is this. Someone appearing unaffected does not mean you were insignificant. It may simply mean they are still operating from protection rather than presence. Because true indifference is peaceful. Defensive indifference is rigid. And when someone has to numb themselves to maintain their story, that's not freedom. That's escape disguised as strength. Now here's where it becomes even more complex and more human. Because despite the defenses, despite the rewritten story, despite the outward indifference, there are moments when the noise stops. And when the noise stops, the truth gets louder. Avoidants are often very composed in public. See, they maintain control, they protect their image. Pride plays a role here. So does ego. Admitting regret outwardly would require vulnerability in front of the very person they withdrew from. That's a level of exposure many of them are not emotionally trained to handle. So you rarely see remorse in real time. But privacy is different. Late at night, during quiet drives, in between distractions, when a new connection doesn't quite feel the same, when something reminds them of a specific memory, a laugh, a conversation, the way you understood them, memory is not easily erased, especially emotional memory. And here's what people don't talk about enough. Avoidants often replay things internally long after they appear to have moved on externally. They think about what was said, what wasn't said, the moment they pulled away, the look on your face, the silence that followed. But instead of processing it with someone, they process it alone, because processing it with you would require reopening vulnerability. Processing it with others would risk exposure. So it stays internal. And that internal processing is often layered with shame, not dramatic shame. Quiet shame, the kind that whispers, you could have handled that better. The kind that surfaces when they encounter emotional maturity elsewhere and recognize the gap. The kind that appears when they realize genuine connection is rare and not easily replaced. Understand something important here. Emotional avoidance doesn't eliminate attachment. It suppresses expression. Attachment bonds form neurologically. They don't dissolve just because someone decides to detach. The nervous system remembers safety. It remembers depth. And when they find themselves in environments that lack what you provided, understanding, emotional patience, authenticity, comparison begins. Not always consciously, but subtly. They may not reach out. They may not admit regret. They may not articulate any of this publicly, but internally, there are often flickers of awareness. Awareness that you weren't asking for too much. Awareness that they shut down instead of stepping up. Awareness that the distance they created protected them, but cost them something meaningful. Now, does this mean they're sitting in constant agony? No, that's not realistic. Human psychology is more nuanced than that. People adapt, they rationalize, they compartmentalize, but emotional truth has a way of resurfacing in stillness. And here's the paradox. The same person who couldn't tolerate closeness in the relationship may later miss the closeness once it's gone. Because missing someone is less threatening than being seen by them. Longing feels safer than vulnerability. Regret feels safer than exposure. And this is why you might never receive the apology you imagined, even if internally they've rehearsed it. Because feeling remorse privately is easier than expressing it publicly. B. Here's what you need to anchor yourself in. Their private realization does not change the impact of their behavior. Their internal replay does not rewrite your experience. And most importantly, their silent regret is not your responsibility to validate. If they feel it, that's part of their growth process or lack thereof. But your healing cannot depend on whether they ever voice it. Because the deepest form of closure is not hearing "I'm sorry," it's knowing the truth within yourself. And the truth is this: when someone replays what they lost in the quiet of their own mind, it's not because you were insignificant. It's because something real is hard to forget, even for someone who tried to. Now we arrive at the part most people don't want to hear. Yes, they may feel it in private. Yes, shame may surface. Yes, there may be quiet moments of recognition. But feeling ashamed is not the same as changing. And this is where people get trapped. We tend to romanticize regret. We think if they realize what they did, they'll come back different. We assume awareness automatically produces growth. But psychologically, that's not how transformation works. Shame by itself does not create evolution. In fact, unmanaged shame often reinforces the very behavior that caused the problem in the first place. Here's why. Shame is painful. It threatens identity. And when a person doesn't have the emotional tools to process that pain constructively, they default to what they know, avoidance. So instead of saying, I need to work on my attachment patterns, they say, I just need someone less demanding. Instead of confronting their emotional limitations, they search for environments where those limitations won't be challenged. The cycle continues. Different person, same pattern, different story, same defense, different beginning, same ending, because insight without action is intellectual entertainment. Real growth requires something far more uncomfortable than regret. It requires accountability. It requires sitting with the fact that you hurt someone, not to drown in self-criticism, but to understand the mechanism behind it. It requires vulnerability, not just in romance, but in self-examination. And that level of introspection is rare unless someone consciously chooses it. You cannot heal an attachment wound by changing partners. You heal it by confronting the wound itself. Now, this is not about labeling avoidance as incapable. People can absolutely grow. Attachment styles are adaptive strategies, not life sentences. But growth only happens when avoidance is replaced with awareness and responsibility. And here's the brutal truth you must accept. You cannot do that work for them. You cannot love someone into emotional maturity. You cannot explain someone into self-awareness. You cannot weight someone into transformation. If they have not independently decided to examine their patterns, then their private shame will remain just that: private, unprocessed, unintegrated, and eventually buried again under distraction or a new narrative. This is where many people confuse potential with reality. You saw who they could be. You saw moments of depth. You saw flashes of vulnerability, and you believed those glimpses represented their full capacity. But potential is not commitment to growth. Capacity is not willingness. And until Mione is willing to face themselves without defense, they will continue protecting their ego at the expense of connection. Now here's where your power returns. Their shame does not obligate you to reopen the door. Their regret does not guarantee emotional safety. Their awareness does not equal readiness. The real question is not whether they feel bad. The real question is whether they have done the internal restructuring necessary to behave differently. Because without restructuring, reconciliation simply resets the cycle, and you deserve more than a recycled version of the same pain. This entire conversation has not been about villainizing anyone. It's been about clarity. When you understand that their suppression, their shame, their rewritten story, their indifference, and their private regret all stem from unaddressed wounds, you stop personalizing what was never truly about your worth. And here is the final truth to carry with you. Someone can secretly feel ashamed of how they treated you and still not be ready to treat you better. And you must never confuse remorse with readiness. So after everything we've unpacked, the suppression, the shame, the rewritten narrative, the defensive indifference, the private regret, and the painful reality that remorse doesn't equal change, we arrive at the deeper truth of this entire conversation. This was never really about whether they feel ashamed. It was about whether you understand what their behavior actually meant and what it didn't. When someone avoids emotion, it can make you question your value. When someone rewrites the story, it can make you question your memory. When someone appears indifferent, it can make you question your significance. And when someone never apologizes, it can make you question your sanity. But clarity dissolves self-doubt. They didn't withdraw because you were too much. They withdrew because intimacy activated what they hadn't healed. They didn't minimize the relationship because it was meaningless. They minimized it because meaning is harder to carry than ego protection. They didn't seem unaffected because you were forgettable. They seemed unaffected because feeling it fully would have required emotional courage. And here's the shift that sets you free. Their shame, whether acknowledged or hidden, is part of their internal process. Your healing is part of yours. You don't need confirmation of their regret to validate your experience. You don't need to hear, "I'm sorry to know you deserved better." You don't need them to evolve in order for you to move forward, because closure is not an apology. Closure is understanding. Closure is recognizing that someone can care and still be incapable, that someone can feel ashamed and still choose avoidance, that someone can miss you and still not be ready for you. And once you truly understand that, something powerful happens. You stop trying to decode their behavior and start honoring your own standards. You stop waiting for emotional maturity to magically appear. You stop interpreting distance as proof of your inadequacy. And you start asking a better question. Not do they secretly feel bad, but do they have the emotional capacity to show up differently? That question changes everything. Because the goal was never to prove they hurt too. The goal is to ensure you don't hurt the same way twice. And here is the final truth I want you to carry with you. If someone had to suppress their feelings, rewrite history, numb themselves, and protect their ego just to leave you, then your love wasn't the weakness in that story, it was the mirror. And not everyone is ready to look at their reflection.